When the dust finally settled on World War II in 1945, the streets of London erupted in absolute euphoria. Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, flashing his iconic V for Victory sign to a roaring, tearful crowd. To the average British citizen, the historical narrative was crystal clear. The British Empire had survived its darkest hour. They had defeated tyranny, won the war, and secured their rightful place as the dominant global superpower for another century. But that victory was a magnificent, carefully constructed illusion. Behind the closed doors of the Treasury and buried deep within the heavily guarded accounting ledgers of the Bank of England, a terrifying reality was unfolding. The British Empire had not actually won the war. They had merely survived it. And the cost of that survival was absolute, catastrophic bankruptcy. The dark truth that no one in London wanted to admit was that the British Empire was not defeated on the bloody battlefields of Europe or in the skies above the English Channel. It was defeated in the quiet, wood-paneled banking boardrooms of New York and Washington, D.C. While Britain was bleeding itself dry, fighting for its very existence, its greatest ally across the Atlantic was quietly executing the most ruthless, brilliant, and complete financial takeover in human history. The United States of America didn't conquer the British Empire with tanks, battleships, or bombs. They bought it, they leveraged it, and ultimately they foreclosed on it. Over the course of just 30 years, spanning two devastating world wars, the United States orchestrated a masterful wealth transfer that completely inverted the global world order. They transformed themselves from a heavily indebted nation into the undisputed financial master of the planet. They systematically stripped the Bank of England of its gold reserves, forced the British to mortgage their most valuable global assets, and ultimately staged a ruthless currency coup that dethroned the British pound sterling to crown the US dollar as the undisputed king of the global economy. In this video, we are going to look past the military history and the geopolitical propaganda to expose the brutal financial mechanics of how America truly became a superpower. We will reveal how the ultimate weapon of global dominance isn't a nuclear bomb, it's a balance sheet. And we will show you exactly how the United States used debt, desperation, and the US dollar to quietly conquer the largest empire the world had ever seen. To truly understand the sheer scale of the British economic collapse, we first have to rewind to the summer of 1914, just before the outbreak of the First World War. At that time, the geopolitical reality was undeniable. London was the undisputed master of the universe. The British Empire controlled roughly a quarter of the world's landmass and population. But more importantly, the Bank of England controlled the global financial system. The British pound sterling was the absolute, unquestioned global reserve currency. If you wanted to conduct international trade, build a railway in South America, or finance a massive industrial project anywhere on Earth, you did it in pounds, and you cleared the transaction through London. By contrast, the United States was still essentially a developing frontier market. In 1914, America was a massive debtor nation. To build their sprawling transcontinental railroads and fuel their rapid industrialization, American corporations had heavily borrowed capital from wealthy European investors, primarily the British. Washington answered to London. But then, the guns of August fired, and the First World War began. The British military leadership entered the conflict thinking it would be a brief traditional war. They were tragically mistaken. World War I introduced the horrors of fully industrialized, mechanized warfare. Millions of men were thrown into the trenches, requiring an endless, staggering supply of artillery shells, machine guns, uniforms, and food. Modern warfare is not just a meat grinder for human lives, it is a black hole for capital. The British government began burning through cash at a rate that defied historical comprehension. Because their domestic factories were completely overwhelmed and their workforce was dying in the mud of France, Britain had to look elsewhere for supplies. They turned their eyes across the Atlantic to the neutral, heavily industrialized, and incredibly eager United States. America officially declared neutrality, but from a purely economic perspective, neutrality was unbelievably profitable. To manage the terrifying logistical nightmare of buying millions of tons of war material, the British government hired the most powerful financial institution in America, the House of Morgan, led by the legendary Wall Street titan J.P. Morgan Jr. Morgan became the sole purchasing agent for the British Empire in the United States. If the British Army needed steel, explosives, or wheat, Morgan bought it from American factories and shipped it across the ocean. But how did the British pay for this massive continuous supply chain? This is where the ultimate wealth transfer began. Initially, Britain paid by forcibly liquidating its citizens' overseas investments. The British government literally forced its wealthy citizens to sell off their American railroad stocks and bonds, handing those highly valuable assets directly back to Wall Street. But the war dragged on and the bloodbath continued. The liquidated stocks were not enough. So, the British resorted to the absolute foundation of their wealth, physical gold. Heavily guarded British warships began quietly slipping across the Atlantic Ocean, their hulls completely loaded with raw gold bullion, delivering the ancient wealth of the British Empire directly into the deep subterranean vaults of New York banks. Yet even the gold was not enough. The cost of survival was simply too high. When the gold reserves dropped to terrifyingly low levels, the British Empire had no choice but to cross the final financial red line. They began taking on massive, high-interest sovereign debt, underwritten by J.P. Morgan and sold to American investors. The trap had been perfectly sprung. While the British Empire was fighting for its very existence and bleeding out a generation of its young men, the United States was experiencing an unprecedented economic boom. American factories were running night and day, paid for by British gold and British debt. By the time the war finally ended in 1918, the global balance of power had permanently, violently shifted. The United States had entered the war late, suffering a fraction of the casualties, but they had completely absorbed the wealth of the Old World. In just 4 short years, America had transformed from the world's largest debtor nation into the world's absolute largest creditor nation. Britain had technically won the war, but mathematically, they were now essentially owned by Wall Street. They were trapped under a mountain of debt that would take nearly a century to pay off, and the American financial elite were just getting started. For the 2 decades following the First World War, the British Empire limped forward, completely crippled by the suffocating weight of American debt. The 1920s and 1930s were an era of brutal economic stagnation in the UK. They were still attempting to project the grand illusion of imperial invincibility, but structurally, the foundation of the empire was rotting from the inside out. Then, in September 1939, Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. When the Second World War officially began, Britain found itself staring down the barrel of an absolute existential nightmare. They were facing the most advanced, mechanized, and terrifying war machine in human history. And the darkest, most closely guarded secret in London was that the Bank of England was already practically broke. They had not even finished paying off the loans from the First War, and now they had to fund an infinitely more expensive sequel. As the Nazi blitzkrieg rapidly conquered Europe and France spectacularly collapsed, Britain stood entirely alone. They desperately needed massive fleets of fighter planes, millions of tons of steel, food and ammunition to survive the German onslaught. And once again, there was only one nation on Earth with the industrial capacity to save them: the United States. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the American Congress were not running a charity. They were running a rising superpower, and they smelled blood in the water. America passed the Neutrality Act of 1939, introducing a ruthless, strictly business policy known as cash and carry. The policy was incredibly simple. The United States would gladly sell military equipment to the British Empire, but Britain had to pay for it entirely in physical gold, up front, and they had to transport the weapons on their own ships. No credit, no loans, just hard assets. What followed was the final desperate liquidation of British wealth. In absolute secrecy, under the cover of darkness, heavily armored British cruisers loaded the last remaining physical gold reserves from the deepest vaults of London. They braved the treacherous U-boat-infested waters of the Atlantic to deliver the lifeblood of the empire directly into the vaults of Fort Knox and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Britain was literally trading its centuries-old wealth for mere weeks of survival. By December 1940, the inevitable mathematical cliff finally arrived. Prime Minister Winston Churchill drafted a highly classified, deeply humiliating letter to President Roosevelt. In it, Churchill admitted the horrifying truth. Britain's gold reserves were gone. Their dollars were gone. They could no longer afford to buy the weapons required to keep Hitler from crossing the English Channel. Britain was completely, undeniably bankrupt. This is the exact moment where the United States executed the ultimate financial coup. Roosevelt knew that if Britain fell, America would eventually have to face Germany alone. He needed Britain to keep fighting, but he also knew that Britain's desperation was the perfect opportunity to permanently dismantle them as a global competitor. Roosevelt introduced the Lend-Lease policy. He famously pitched it to the American public as a friendly, neighborly act, like lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. But the economic reality of Lend-Lease was not a friendly loan. It was a hostile corporate takeover. It was the absolute foreclosure of the British Empire. America agreed to lend Britain the weapons, food, and oil they needed to survive, but the price was astronomical. In exchange for the lifeline, Washington systematically stripped Britain of its remaining global power. Through agreements like the Destroyers for Buses deal, America gave Britain 50 highly obsolete World War I-era naval destroyers. In return, the United States demanded 99-year leases on highly strategic British military and naval bases across the globe, from the Caribbean to the Atlantic. Furthermore, Washington forced Britain to sign agreements that crippled their future ability to trade. They forced the UK to dismantle the imperial preference system, prying open the closed markets of the British Empire so that American corporations could dominate global trade after the war. The U.S. essentially prohibited Britain from exporting any goods that were made with Lend-Lease materials, intentionally shutting down Britain's export economy while American factories cornered the global market. By the time the war ended, the visual map of the world still showed a massive British Empire painted in imperial pink. But the map was a lie. The gold was gone. The strategic choke points and military bases were under American control. The export markets had been captured by Wall Street. Britain had survived the war, but they had traded their empire to pay for the ammunition. By the summer of 1944, the Allied forces had landed on the beaches of Normandy, and the ultimate military defeat of Nazi Germany was finally in sight. But while millions of soldiers were still bleeding and dying in the rubble of Europe, a completely different kind of war was being quietly concluded inside a luxurious, secluded resort hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. This was the Bretton Woods Conference. Officially, the United States had invited delegates from 44 allied nations to design a new, stable international monetary system for the post-war world. They claimed the goal was to prevent another Great Depression and foster global economic cooperation. But behind the polite handshakes and the diplomatic smiles, Bretton Woods was not a negotiation. It was a coronation. It was the exact moment the United States officially executed its currency coup and dethroned the British Empire. The conference was entirely dominated by a brutal, head-to-head clash between two brilliant economic minds, representing two empires moving in opposite directions. Representing the fading, heavily indebted British Empire was the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes arrived in America in failing health, carrying the desperate, impossible burden of trying to preserve Britain's status as a first-rate financial power. Keynes knew that if the post-war world was dominated by one single currency, the nation controlling that currency would effectively rule the globe. To prevent complete American hegemony, Keynes proposed a brilliant, neutral system. He pitched the creation of a brand new supranational global reserve currency called the Bancor. Under Keynes's plan, no single nation would have the exorbitant privilege of printing the world's reserve currency. The system would force heavily exporting nations like the U.S. to reinvest their surpluses back into debtor nations like Britain, creating a balanced, cooperative global economy. It was a beautiful, elegant theory to save the British economy. But across the table sat Harry Dexter White, representing the United States Treasury. White was a ruthless bureaucratic operator who possessed a cold, terrifying mathematical advantage. He listened to Keynes's elegant plea for the Bancor and a balanced global system, and he systematically crushed it. White knew that the United States did not need to negotiate. They held the ultimate financial trump card. Because of the massive wealth transfers of World War I and the brutal cash-and-carry and Lend-Lease policies of World War II, the United States had successfully drained the wealth of the Old World. By 1944, America sat on an unimaginable hoard of physical gold. They controlled nearly 80% of all the monetary gold reserves on the entire planet. In the ruthless reality of global finance, the golden rule is absolute. He who has the gold makes the rules. Harry Dexter White dictated terms that would forever alter human history. There would be no neutral Bancor. There would be no balanced global system. Instead, White established a system where the United States dollar would become the unquestioned center of the financial universe. The Bretton Woods Agreement dictated that the U.S. dollar would be directly pegged to physical gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. In turn, every other currency on Earth, the franc, the mark, the yen, and the once mighty British pound, would be pegged to the U.S. dollar. It was a masterstroke of financial imperialism. By forcing the world to trade in dollars and forcing global central banks to hold dollars in their vaults instead of gold, the United States essentially forced the entire planet to finance the American empire. If a country wanted to buy oil, rebuild their bombed-out cities, or engage in international trade, they needed American paper. John Maynard Keynes was deeply humiliated. He realized that Britain had not just lost its financial supremacy, it had officially become a subordinate client state of the American banking system. The pound sterling, which had proudly ruled global trade for over a century, was permanently relegated to second-tier status. The British Empire had survived the bombs of the Luftwaffe, but it had been entirely conquered by the American printing press. If you are fascinated by the hidden mechanics of global power and want to understand how empires use debt and currency to secretly control the world, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Hit the bell icon because we are consistently uncovering the darkest economic secrets that the history books leave out. By 1956, 12 years after the Bretton Woods Conference had stripped them of their financial supremacy, the British Empire was a hollow, heavily mortgaged shell of its former glory. But the politicians sitting in the halls of Westminster still suffered from a fatal imperial delusion. They still believed that the Royal Navy ruled the waves. They still operated under the arrogant assumption that when Britain gave an order, the rest of the developing world had to unconditionally obey. It took one monumental geopolitical crisis to finally, brutally shatter that illusion forever. In the summer of 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser made a bold, defiant move that shocked the old world. He officially nationalized the Suez Canal. For the British, this was an absolute outrage. The canal was the main artery of their fading empire, the vital, highly profitable shipping lane that connected Europe to the massive oil fields of the Middle East. It was owned primarily by British and French corporate shareholders, and Nasser had just taken it from them. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden was furious. Operating under the outdated assumption that Britain was still an unchecked global hegemon, he authorized a highly classified, completely illegal military operation. In a coordinated secret conspiracy, Israel, France, and Britain launched a massive, sudden invasion of Egypt to crush Nasser and seize control of the canal by sheer military force. From a purely tactical perspective, the invasion was rapid and effective. British paratroopers dropped from the sky, and the Allied forces began securing the canal zone. But in Washington, D.C., President Dwight E. Eisenhower watched the invasion with absolute burning rage. Eisenhower was not primarily concerned with the morality of the invasion. He was furious that the British had dared to act without asking for America's permission. The United States was locked in a tense, terrifying Cold War with the Soviet Union, and Britain's blatant old-school imperial land grab was actively driving the entire Arab world directly into the arms of the Soviets. Eisenhower decided it was exactly the right moment to put the British dog firmly back on its financial leash. He did not threaten military action. He didn't have to move a single American aircraft carrier or threaten to fire a single bullet. Eisenhower simply reached into the American financial arsenal and pulled out a weapon far more destructive than a nuclear bomb: the crushing, absolute leverage of the U.S. dollar. As the invasion of Egypt sparked global market panic, international investors began aggressively dumping the British pound. To prevent their currency from completely collapsing, the Bank of England desperately needed an emergency injection of U.S. dollars from the International Monetary Fund to prop up their reserves. Eisenhower picked up the phone and personally blocked the IMF loan. But he didn't stop there. He delivered a chilling, undeniable financial ultimatum directly to London. Eisenhower threatened that if Britain did not immediately halt the invasion and withdraw its troops, the United States Treasury would actively dump its own massive holdings of British sterling bonds onto the open market. It was a financial death sentence. If the U.S. dumped the pound, the currency would instantly crash into the abyss. Britain would be entirely unable to afford essential imports like food and oil. Their domestic economy would completely collapse in a matter of days, leading to starvation, riots, and total ruin. The British Prime Minister was faced with the terrifying, undeniable reality of the New World Order. Britain was no longer a superpower. They were a financial hostage. Within hours of Eisenhower's threat, Anthony Eden unconditionally surrendered. He ordered a full, deeply humiliating military withdrawal from Egypt. The Suez Crisis was not just a military failure. It was the most public, devastating humiliation in the long history of the British Empire. The entire world watched in stunned silence as the once mighty British Lion was effortlessly swatted down by a single phone call from the American Treasury. It was the definitive, undeniable proof that the era of empires built on warships and colonies was permanently dead. The new era had begun, and the world was now entirely ruled by the almighty dollar. The collapse of the British Empire wasn't a military defeat, it was a masterclass in financial warfare. The United States didn't drop a single bomb on London to become the undisputed global superpower. They simply opened their checkbook, leveraged Britain's absolute desperation, and weaponized the U.S. dollar. By the time the British elite finally realized they had been conquered, the ink on the accounting ledgers was already dry. America had successfully executed the greatest wealth transfer in human history. But economics is a ruthless, unforgiving cycle, and history loves a dark irony. The ultimate tragedy of this story is not what happened to the British Empire in the 1950s. The true terrifying reality is what is happening to the United States right now. Today, America is no longer the industrialized, gold-hoarding creditor nation of 1945. They no longer possess the infinite financial leverage they once held over the old world. Instead, they have become the exact thing they destroyed. Just like the British Empire in its final dying days, modern America is drowning in tens of trillions of dollars of sovereign debt. They have outsourced their manufacturing, they are bleeding capital to fund endless proxy wars, and they are desperately weaponizing their currency to maintain a crumbling grip on global power. The American empire is actively repeating the exact same fatal economic mistakes that brought down the British. The playbook hasn't changed, only the names have. Every single global superpower follows the exact same predictable mathematical path from dominance to absolute collapse. If you want to see exactly how this cycle ends, and more importantly, how much time the current US dollar system has left before it completely fractures, you need to watch my full breakdown right here. The 7 stages of empire collapse, why America is at stage 6. Click the video on your screen right now, or find the link down in the pinned comment below. The wealth transfer of our generation has already begun. I will see you in that video.